Hello, I'm Deane Bowers from the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History, and I'm here to give you a short talk about pollinators. However, I'm going to talk about a particular group of pollinators, and that is pollinators other than bees. Most of us think about bees as the most important pollinators, which they are. However, there are other pollinators that are extremely important and important for many of the crops that we eat and many of the plants that grow here in Colorado. So what I'd like to do is share my screen with you and tell you a little bit about some of those other pollinators. So the title of my talk, More Than Bees. This is because there are a lot of other animals that are very important as pollinators besides bees. I'm the curator of the insect collection here at the University of Colorado, and we have a very large bee collection, but we also have examples of a lot of other pollinators. So I'm going to go beyond bees and talk specifically about some of these other insects that can be important as pollinators. So what I'll do first is talk a little bit about the global importance of pollinators, then very briefly remind you how pollination actually works. And then I'll talk about some of the other groups of insects that can serve as important pollinators and the characteristics of some of the plants that they pollinate. So when we think about pollination, most of us think about bees as pollinators. Many of us think primarily about honeybees, but there are other bees that are extremely important as well. However, what I'd like to do today is talk about beyond the bee, some of these other insect species, and very briefly about other animals as well that can serve as important pollinators. So about 90% of all flowering plants require some kind of a pollinator. Most of these are pollinated by insects, although some plants have wind as the agent of pollination, but 90% of all flowering plants are pollinated by animals. And many of these pollinators, in fact, most of these pollinators are insects. So here's a little example that I think illustrates very well what our grocery stores would look like if we didn't have bee pollination. Emphasizing the importance of bees as pollinators, you can see here what our produce choices look like with bees around. And here's what our produce choices might look like without bees. So bees are crucial as pollinators of many of the crops that we eat. In the US, honeybees are responsible for over $20 billion worth of crop production. However, although we primarily think of honeybees as the most important pollinators, remember honeybees were introduced into North America with the early settlers. They're not native to North America. And so about $10 billion worth of pollination is accomplished by native bees, not by honeybees. And this is worth a huge amount of money. But if we think about the gorgeous landscape that we live in here in Colorado and take a look at this shot showing a lot of different native Colorado wildflowers, many of these plant species are not pollinated by bees, but in fact are pollinated by other groups of insects or other groups of animals. For example, flies, hummingbirds, beetles, and moths are all important pollinators of native Colorado plants. So how does pollination work? What happens during pollination? Well, pollination involves the transfer of pollen from the male part of the flower, the anther, to the female part of the flower, the stigma. So here's a great shot of a fly that's just loaded with these adorable little pollinia, as they're called, masses of pollen. And what happens when a pollinator visits is it picks up pollen from one individual plant, carries it on its body somewhere to the stigma of another part of the plant. That pollen then fertilizes the ovules, and eventually those ovules become seeds. So flowers need go-betweens. Most flowering plants are what are called self-incompatible. And what that means is that when pollen is collected from the same individual flower or the same individual plant, it cannot successfully pollinate another flower on that same individual plant. So flowers of one individual can't be fertilized by pollen from the same individual. So go-betweens of some kind are required. Now, pollen comes in many different shapes and sizes, and the shape and size of pollen can be important in determining whether pollination actually occurs, because pollination has to be between individuals of the same species. And so pollen needs to get from the anthers of one individual to the stigma of another. And if the pollen is compatible, the pollen grain germinates and it produces this long pollen tube, and the gametes go down through this pollen tube to the ovule where fertilization occurs. Now, not all flowering plants need go-betweens. There are some species of flowering plants that are self-compatible. That is, they can self-fertilize. Violets, for example, are one such species. One consequence of that, however, is that there may be reduced genetic variability, which can be a problem, especially in dealing with rapid changes in the environment. Okay, so who are the pollinators? Who does this pollination? Well, bees, as I've talked about, are probably the most important pollinators, but there are many other extremely important pollinators as well. I'm not going to talk very much about vertebrates as pollinators, but there are some vertebrates that are extremely important pollinators. For example, hummingbirds, shown here. And right now here in Colorado, we have a lot of hummingbirds that are starting to come down out of the mountains and migrate south for overwintering. And hummingbirds tend to be attracted to flowers that are red and tubular. So if you want to attract hummingbirds to your garden, you can plant some of these species such as red penstemons, scarlet gilia, trumpet vine, zauschneria, shown down here, commonly known as hummingbird trumpet, or cardinal flowers. Bats can also be important pollinators. Plants that are pollinated by bats tend to have really big, robust flowers because bats are kind of awkward pollinators. Here's this wonderful shot of a bat showing pollen all over the face of that bat, because that's essentially how they pollinate. They go into this flower to get nectar. They stick their face into the flower. It becomes covered with pollen. And then when they go to the next flower, they may actually be able to fertilize it because of this pollen that's all over their faces. But what I'd like to talk about today is insects, which are the most important pollinators, and especially dwelling on insects other than bees. Although, as I've talked about, bees are probably the most important group of pollinators. So I'll talk a little bit about beetles, butterflies, and moths, a little bit actually about ants as pollinators. So, as I said, bees and wasps are the most important pollinators, but they are definitely not the only insect pollinators. So why do we consider bees the most important pollinators? Well, one, the other insects that are pollinators typically just collect nectar or pollen to feed themselves. Bees, however, collect nectar and pollen not only to feed themselves, but they also carry this nectar and pollen back to feed their offspring. So they use these materials for consumption by themselves, but also to feed their brood, whereas most other groups of pollinating insects don't do this. And there are about 30,000 species of bees in the world, and all of them visit flowers. And most of them collect nectar and pollen to feed to their brood. But now I'd like to talk about some other important groups of insect pollinators. For example, wasps. Wasps are in the same order as bees, the Hymenoptera, and wasps very commonly visit flowers, and typically they're collecting nectar and pollen for themselves to eat. A lot of the wasps that we see around here in Colorado right now actually collect caterpillars or other insect prey or spider prey to take back to their young developing in their nests, but they as individuals eat pollen and nectar. And in the process of collecting pollen and nectar, they can transfer pollen and thus fertilize plants. A really interesting example of wasp pollination is of figs. So figs are a really unusual type of angiosperm in that the flowers are actually inside the figs. So when you eat figs, you're eating flowers and seeds that are developing inside the figs. And there's this group of highly specialized tiny, tiny wasps that actually enter the fig, pollinate these flowers inside the fig, and ultimately those fertilized flowers, fertilized ovules lead to the development of really tiny seeds. So when you eat a fig Newton, you're crunching these little tiny seeds in your mouth. So figs are very highly specialized for pollination by these specialist wasps. What about another group of bee relatives, ants? Now, we see ants visiting flowers all the time. And it's been questionable whether ants could actually serve as important pollinators or not. And they're uncommon as pollinators. They tend to visit flowers primarily for nectar, which they collect and can take back to their nest to feed to the developing young. And typically they don't pollinate. And so it's been kind of controversial about whether ants are ever serving as important pollinators. Well, recently in the last couple of years, there's been some papers coming out showing that in fact ants can be very important pollinators. For example, this is a paper that just came out in 2019 about this really adorable plant, Pollinators, which occurs in Brazil. And what these researchers found was when they excluded ants from the flowers, that the seed set of individual plants was much lower. So here's an ant visiting the flower here, and here's the head of the ant with little pollen grains on it. So evidence is accumulating then that ants can be important pollinators. Another group that's really important as pollinators are the butterflies and moths, the Lepidoptera. Butterflies, here's several species that you can find here in Colorado. Well, actually, this is a tropical species, so that one's not here in Colorado. But pollination by butterflies and moths are attracted to different types of flowers, or flowers that show different suites of characteristics, primarily because butterflies fly during the day and moths typically fly at night. So butterfly pollinated flowers tend to be brightly colored, yellow, red, or blue. They tend to have a landing platform that the butterflies can land upon. They tend to be sweet or sometimes unscented, day blooming, and they produce a fair amount of nectar for these butterflies to collect. Moths fly at night. And so the characteristics of flowers that are pollinated by moths are quite different than those that are pollinated by butterflies. So here you can see several species of hummingbird moths, as they're called, because a lot of them are quite large and can be mistaken for hummingbirds. And one thing you can see is how long the proboscis is on many of these species. And this is a Nicotiana from my garden, and you can see this has really, really long tubular flowers. And so a moth needs this really long proboscis in order to get down to the base of this tubular flower where the nectar occurs. And so moth-pollinated flowers tend to be white or pale green. They have a long, narrow tube, and they have a strong scent, and they bloom at night. Diptera flowers, for example, shown here, are tightly curled up during the day, and you can actually watch the blossoms unfurl right at dusk, and then they start producing their scent and attract the moths in. So the moths visit these flowers for nectar, and in doing so, brush against the anthers, collect the pollen, and then can transfer that pollen to the stigma of another individual plant. And here's this great photograph of a moth with a really awesome proboscis. So here's the body of the moth right here, and here's its proboscis, which has been unwound and is about 4 times as long as the body of the moth. So the next group I'd like to talk about are the flies. So we don't necessarily think of flies as pollinators, but in fact, they can be very important pollinators. There are some groups of flies that are specialist pollinators. And here you can see several different species visiting flowers. There are some interesting characteristics of flowers that are pollinated by flies. For example, they often smell like carrion or dung. And in fact, what they're doing is fooling, if you will, the flies into visiting them, because the flies are actually looking for carrion or dung as a place to lay their eggs. They also tend to be dark purple or red colored, and they can actually be pretty stinky. And here's a really great example of fly pollination that we have here in Colorado. So this is Polemonium, or Jacob's ladder, a very common plant that grows in the mountains here in Colorado. And it turns out that this species at low elevation has a very sweet smell and is pollinated primarily by bumblebees. At high elevation, however, it has a skunky smell and is pollinated by flies. And so if you go hiking on a trail that covers a fair amount of elevation, you can actually smell the difference in the flowers at lower elevation, which tend to be sweeter, which are sweeter smelling, and the flowers at higher elevation, which are skunky. And then beetles. We don't really think of beetles as important pollinators, and they're commonly called mess and soil pollinators because they're pretty inefficient. They visit flowers to eat the pollen, and in so doing, they can collect pollen. So you can see on the feet and the body of this beetle are a lot of pollen grains. And so as they're feeding, they can accumulate these pollen grains on their body. And then when they visit another flower of the same species, but on a different individual, they can actually pollinate. These are a couple pictures of soldier beetles, which are a group of beetles that we see very commonly on flowers at about this time of year here in Colorado. So those flowers that are pollinated by beetles tend to be white to dull white or light yellow or pale green. They're strongly fruity, and they're open during the day, and they have moderate amounts of nectar. But the nectar isn't what the beetles are after. They're actually there eating the pollen. And so what I hope I've done for you today is give you a little bit of an introduction to some of the other groups of insects that are important pollinators, bearing in mind that on our globe, over 90% of all flowering plants require some kind of a go-between, an individual that can carry pollen from one plant to another. And insects are the most important group of these pollinators. And so I hope I've also shown you that not only bees can be really important pollinators. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening and provide a little bit of information about the CU Museum of Natural History. We have a lot of online programs that are ongoing now, and so you can take a look at colorado.edu/CUmuseum. We have a lot going on, so please take a look. And thanks very much for listening.